So, hello everybody. It's really great to be here. I'm very excited. This is the first time I'm really doing a lecture like this one, and then in a very esteemed company like you, students at the Collège de Bruges. This is something I didn't manage to do, so maybe something I have to still consider. But before I go on with my speech, I actually would like to start with a video clip, because I want also to show that nowadays we don't only talk, but we watch a lot. So here you go.
As part of an experiment to explore the human mind, we asked 22 people to solve the same riddle and recorded their responses. Feel free to participate also. Are you ready?
The riddle. A father is about to bring his son to a job interview, applying for a position at a large stockbrokers company in the city. Just as they arrive at the company's parking lot, the son's phone rings. He looks at his father, who says, "Go ahead, answer it." The caller is the trading company CEO, who says, "Good luck, son, you've got this." The son ends the call and once again looks at his father, who is still next to him in their car. How is this possible?
He gets a call from the CEO, but it says,
"Good luck, son."
But he was next to him.
So it's not the father.
I think it was probably an audio recording of his father.
Maybe he made a demo tape.
Like he has two fathers?
This is a hard one.
Maybe it's a word joke, like it's the grandfather of the son.
No, I think his name is Son.
I don't know.
Maybe it's just like an old man, you know, calling a younger guy son.
I have no idea.
The answer. It's his mother.
Oh, that's so stupid. Yes, of course.
"Ah,
I should have thought of that, yes.
The CEO is a woman.
So I'm biased, in a sense. Is this about diversity and inclusion?
It's really mind-blowing, actually.
So I always thought that I'm not very sexist. But in spite of that, I think these subconscious biases are there in everyone's mind.
How much bias I still have in terms of thinking that the CEO needs to be a man.
Yeah, I definitely was picturing a man.
They identify with males more than females these days.
Why can't women also be CEOs or doctors or, right?
When I think about a CEO or someone that's high positioned within a company, I mostly think of men.
And it's a shame, I think.
And that's so weird, because I'm a CEO, and I'm a woman.
And I want to be a CEO. Why didn't I think about that? Crap.
I believe women can absolutely be CEOs.
And that's definitely something that we should work on, especially when you're saying that so many people have been told this riddle and most people haven't gotten it.
Women make great CEOs and great leaders as well. And yet only 5% of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. Let's change our mindset.
Right.
As
From the reactions I could hear, I think that some of you are familiar with the riddle, but I think it's a very good one to really introduce us or take us into this question of what does this tell us, or what does this tell you? And of course, showing something like this helps one to realize that we all hold beliefs and that we all have assumptions or attitudes subconsciously that affect the way we feel and think about others around us. And actually, the fact that we all have biases is really not something that should worry us, because it's a result of how we have been brought up. It's a result of experiences that you go through when you go through life. It's a question of your surroundings. And what is more important is that we are aware of them. and that we are conscious, therefore, about the biases that we have. But what happens to our foreign and security policy when most decision makers have these unconscious biases? And that is a question to start with that I would like to put to you. What happens if these biases are in people that determine our foreign and security policy? Does anybody want to? Yes, please.
Well, it limits ourselves first of all, right? Because we might be forced to think that we're not good enough to make it, and we won't even think of the option. So the lack of role models and the lack of empowerment is actually striking to get yourself.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. I saw another question, another hand here, I think. No? There's two more over there, in the middle, yeah.
If we have this bias that women are not decision maker or don't have the capacity to take decision, then we're just not going to listen to them. So we have way less people that can bring solution to the table.
And I would just add to that if we're not aware of our biases, then we think that the decisions we make are actually objective and neutral, but they could not be, and we don't notice that, and that's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you got it right. We really need to make sure, of course, that the realities and needs of women are taken into account equally, because equality, as one says, requires not 30% and not 40%, but 50%. And as was elaborated in a recent UN report that you may have seen, it came out just last month, with the current rate of progress, it will take us 300 years to achieve gender equality. So not 20 or 75 as we want to make it happen according to the SDGs, but 300 years. And actually the study also reveals how gender disparities are actually worsening in the face of what we can consider cascading global crises. We first had, of course, the corona pandemic, we have violent conflicts, and we have climate change, and we can couple that too with the backlash against women's sexual and reproductive health and rights that we see around the world. And one thing is for sure, we do not have 300 years to achieve gender equality. So that's why I'm here today. That's why I'm grateful that I was invited to be here with you by the director, of course, of the college. And I'm happy to talk to you about gender and diversity, but I also want to talk to you about leadership. And I will explain to you how these two, gender equality and leadership, are related, and why the linkage between these two is so important, especially in the current geopolitical context, as the rector already started hinting. Now, the war in Ukraine has made two things very clear. First of all, the war that is waged by Russia has profoundly upset the geopolitical order as we knew it, placing, among other things, because of course there's a lot going on and happening right now, but it places, among other things, gender equality at the heart of the political debates. Those who are antagonistic to the West and to Western values have manipulated gender equality to further trigger polarization within, but also between nation states. And the second thing the war in Ukraine has made clear is it points to the need for a leadership that is aware of these fundamental changes and what is required to deal with these. So I will come back to you about that, what I mean by this, but allow me first to elaborate on the initial point. The war waged by Russia has caused a sea change in geopolitical relations, and a new world order has developed and will continue to develop. We are more and more encountered with a confrontation between, on the one hand, democratic countries that uphold the universality of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and on the other hand, illiberal countries that contest a rules-based international order. And the separation between these groups of countries with dramatically opposing views and visions for the future runs through Europe. European countries see the values that we hold high, that they see that these values are being challenged, like the rule of law, like the rights of individuals to be equal and to have equal rights to live their life the way they choose and make their own choices. And actually, Europe itself has become the target of disinformation campaigns and foreign interference, promoting a narrative that seems to be successful, unfortunately, in several other places around the world. Now, what I think for today is very relevant to note is that disinformation and influence operations are not gender neutral. In fact, it's quite the opposite. What seems to cut across all of them are the following three things. First, these disinformation and influence operations intentionally misrepresent gender equality as a Western ideology that is harmful for societies. They portray gender equality as something that is linked to the erosion of social norms and opposed to the so-called traditional family values. Second, they utilize harmful gender stereotypes as a deliberate tactic in an attempt to discredit Western women politicians and women journalists, in particular those amongst them who do not subscribe to a conservative worldview. The other side of the same coin is that these very harmful stereotypes on masculinities are being used to incite aggression in men. And third, this type of disinformation and influencing is also meant to intentionally polarize democratic debates through the use of social media platforms with the objective to incite fear and hatred against different parts of the population, but particularly the LGBTIQ community. It is difficult to pinpoint a specific time when this started. Some scholars have traced organized anti-gender campaigns all the way back to the 1990s. What seems to be clear is that their influence in foreign policy became more evident from approximately 2010 onwards. Since then, there seemed to be an ample body of evidence that these very gendered disinformation narratives have been directly linked to and largely sponsored by foreign powers that are antagonistic to Europe and its democratic values. Now, this may sound like a topic of relevance only to Europe or to the West, but unfortunately, and this is an experience I can share with you, this has a much broader and a much more international or global impact. You need to know, and you probably do, that gender equality did not used to be a contested topic. It was widely understood to refer to equality between women and men in respect of their rights, responsibilities, and opportunities, while recognizing that there were not only biological differences between men and women, but also that men and women were assigned with socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, or attributes that a given society considers appropriate for women and men. What I would like to point out is this is, in fact, a definition that is also used in the EU Gender Action Plan 3 that you may have heard of and which is commonly referred to as GAP 3. We like acronyms in the EU. And this is a policy framework for gender, saying very generally, but this is a policy framework for gender mainstreaming in the EU, so in our own house, and in the EU's external actions. Where GAP 3 does differ from its predecessors is that it places a focus on intersectionality, highlighting that the EU should focus on the most disadvantaged women, taking into consideration also factors such as racial, ethnic and religious background, age, disability and sexuality. And GAP 3 says that it should be read in conjunction with the EU LGBTIQ equality strategy. GAP 3, unfortunately, has not been endorsed by all EU member states. If anything, and we can elaborate on it later on, but if anything, this is a clear indication that discussions on gender equality are complex, even just within our EU. A similar fate to that of GAP 3 applies to the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, which is better known as the Istanbul Convention. Its entering into force in 2014 was followed by a widespread disinformation campaign and false narratives about the convention, especially about the word gender that is included in the convention's text. And these intentional misrepresentations have diverted the discussion about the Istanbul Convention from gender equality, which the convention is really about, to gender identity, which the convention is not about. As a result, though, in some countries, the Istanbul Convention has been ruled as unconstitutional. And in this context, it has also not been possible for the EU as a whole to become party to the convention. One neighboring country to the EU has even, unfortunately, withdrawn from the convention. For me, as an ambassador for gender and diversity, this is worrying for various reasons and on multiple levels. First of all, we are living in times where international agreements on women's rights are being held hostage to conservative powers and targets of deliberate disinformation campaigns. The strong policy frameworks that women's rights organizations have fought for so successfully still exist, but their implementation is becoming more and more difficult. For instance, when we try to develop practical tools such as action plans to follow up on these conventions. New international agreements, at least progressive ones, are starting to become, I'm afraid, rather impossible to imagine. Secondly, we are living in times where states across the world seem to have forgotten that they signed up to international conventions that guarantee each person's right to non-discrimination. Applying an intersectional lens to gender equality is about non-discrimination. It is about ensuring that we leave no one behind, and that in foreign policy we do not only see the world as it is presented to white women, but also to women of color, women of different religious affiliations, women with a migrant background, or women with a disability and LGBTIQ women. Lastly, in respect of diversity and non-discrimination beyond gender equality, we are living in times where LGBTIQ persons and their identities have been hijacked as propaganda tools to spew hate, to polarize, to divide societies, and to trigger disunity in Europe and beyond. Times where LGBTIQ persons face hate crimes and are even paying the price of the global power politics with their lives. We see that in Iran these days, for instance. Clearly, these are developments that we need to counter with all the might that we can muster. And actually, I can also share with you on a very personal basis that so many people around the world appeal to the EU as the one place where this can be done, mustering this might. But how? What can we do as EU to counter this trend? And what answers do we have to this challenge? This brings me to the second thing that the war in Ukraine has brought to us. in my view, together with the newly shaped world order. The war in Ukraine reinforces the need for a different type of leadership. We will increasingly need leaders who are conscious of these fundamental changes and what they do to people, and who are able to act on these. But before I elaborate on this, let us go back a little to the policy structure that we currently have in place. Because really, and you would say, on paper, everything is fine. We have an impressive set of international conventions and treaties. And next year, actually, we will be celebrating 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in its Article 2 specifies, and there I quote, "Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status." Furthermore, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW in short, that came into force 41 years ago, has been ratified by 189 of the 193 UN member states. And through the 1995 Beijing Platform for Action, the world leaders put forward a future where women and girls could exercise their freedoms and choices and realize their rights. And the EU in particular has a very robust policy framework on gender equality. The EU Gender Equality Strategy of 2020 to 2025, there is the European Pillar of Social Rights, and there is, what I mentioned to you before, the Gender Action Plan 3. And together with an action plan on human rights and democracy, these documents really provide us with a clear compass to promote gender equality and equal opportunities, and more generally, an inclusive society where everybody can participate. So the question is, and the question I'm also asking you today, why does it not work? Why, despite all the legal frameworks and commitments, are we still so far away from the main objectives? And why do we continue to have far too few women in leading positions, be it in politics or in government agencies, at the highest courts or on companies' boards? Why is gender equality so hard to achieve? And why is it so difficult, despite all these years and despite all these texts and documents that we have, to realize this goal? My answer to that question is the world in which we live, in which we work, and in which we have to perform, and the world in which we raise our children, this world is not equal. This world does not provide us with the same opportunities. And when we don't have the same opportunities, it harms women. And by doing so, it harms men as well. To give you an example, across the world, women perform 3 times more unpaid care work than men. And in no country, not a single country in the world, men and women provide an equal share of unpaid care work. Yet doing so would actually be good for men. This is for the male students in the room. Be aware, because benefits of men carrying out more equitable portions of unpaid care work, particularly childcare, include an enhanced mental health and well-being amongst men, and reduce incidences of violent or risky behavior, including less alcohol or drug abuse. A few further facts and figures. Women account for only a quarter, 26% to be exact, of national parliamentarians. And while land is perhaps the most important economic asset globally, less than 15% of agricultural landowners are women. And finally, approximately 1 in every 3 women worldwide have experienced some kind of physical or sexual violence. So these facts are very telling. We have homework to do in Europe, but also in the world. And what we increasingly need is a new type of leadership to deal with these trends and a new focus in our foreign policy. What we need is a foreign policy that takes into consideration women, that starts from the awareness that women play a meaningful role, whether it be in political discussions, in peace processes, or in policy decision making. It is not a question of the label that we attach to it. It's a question of doing it. It's a question of practicing what we preach and of walking the talk. And it is a question of making sure that everybody, so every staff member of the EEAS, where I work, puts its weight into achieving this. And now this, I would share with you, is the real hard work. This is why an ambassador for gender and diversity is still needed, even today in 2022. Because thinking along these lines is still not ingrained in the minds of people. It's not ingrained in the minds of my colleagues, and it's not ingrained in the minds of society. And to change that, I consider really one of my core tasks. Why do I need to explain that when we discuss Ukraine, for instance, and we discuss accountability, that we need to be specific and recognize that we also talk about sexual violence against women and the need to ensure that gender equality is taken into account when we talk about recovery planning? Or why is it not an automaticity that when we write Council conclusions on Afghanistan, for instance, we include a specific reference to the situation of women and girls that requires monitoring? Why does it come more naturally to focus on military means to deal with a conflict than to focus on the contribution women can bring to reduce the chances of a violent conflict? Or how important gender equality actually is to avoid a violent conflict in the first place? Now this, dear future colleagues, is where convincing, repeating, insisting, cajoling is very much needed. And to put it bluntly, I'm from the Netherlands, so we are known for doing this, one needs to be a pain to others who do not want to see it, or who simply do not see it, who consider this an extra or an add-on once we have time for add-ons. Changing the mindset of policymakers, of diplomats and politicians is urgent, and we need to put an end to this. If I can do anything to help that process, to speed up this change, I will really consider my job successful. And this is for me the essence of being Ambassador for Gender and Diversity, a role that, in my view, one day should just become superfluous. Now, does this mean that the EU needs, and we touched upon it very briefly in the introductory part, but does it mean that the EU needs to follow the examples of countries like Sweden or Spain and formally adopt a feminist foreign policy? This is a discussion that in the EU is yet to be had. Let me just say here that I think the objectives as such can be achieved quite well with the current policy structure or framework, that we have in place. There is, in my view, though, something more important that is needed now. And that is referred to as the missing piece of the puzzle. And it is called gender responsive leadership. Because despite all the progress made, we are still not advancing enough nor quick enough. Gender equality continually keeps being pushed to the margins in the global security debate and throughout our organizations. We cannot continue to deal with gender equality only once we have taken care of the other more important issues. If the leadership is not the first one to promote gender equality and setting a good example, then who will? Change processes need to be led by the management, starting from the very top. And this also applies to the process of integrating a gender perspective in everything that we do. And doing this is a skill that everyone can learn, but it is the responsibility of the leadership to ensure that institutions have the capacity to transform that skill into actionable deliverables. Accountability is a key word here, and this is created by clearly defining promotion of gender equality as a leadership responsibility. And this requires more than reporting about equality issues or even working on gender balance in one's own organization. It requires bold initiatives. And there is one I would like to mention. It was taken recently at the beginning of this year, earlier this year, by the current Secretary General of the EEAS, Stefano Sannino. When we concluded that Afghan women needed to have a voice in decisions that concern them or their country. And to facilitate this, we launched an Afghan Women Leaders Forum, a platform that includes women of diverse backgrounds, women from the Afghan diaspora in countries like this one, but also women who decided to stay in Afghanistan after the Taliban took over. There are other examples too of similar forums, not always as big and prominent as this one, but important nonetheless. We introduced the concept of gender-responsive leadership in the EEAS Senior Management Board. And actually, this week, being the EU Ambassadors Conference, we've made sure that gender equality and diversity are important topics on the agenda, and that we, to give you another small example, avoid any panel discussion being exclusively male. Sometimes changes require a lot of small steps. So these examples also go to show when we have a leadership that is gender responsive, things do change and change becomes possible. Let me mention in this regard also the speech that the current President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, delivered on the occasion of the State of the Union on 14 September. She did this speech after meeting with young people in Thésée. And she said, 1,500 young people have different views, come from different countries, have different backgrounds, and speak different languages. And yet, there is something that connects them. They share a set of values and ideals. They believe in these values. They are all passionate about something larger than themselves. This generation is a generation of dreamers, but also of makers. We should put their aspirations at the heart of everything we do. We should leave the world a better place for the next generation. End of the quote. What the President, Ms. von der Leyen, the first woman President of the Commission, did not mention is this. Her ambition requires a kind of leadership that consistently sees the value in integrating a gender perspective. The fact that she included a reference to the Istanbul Convention in her very candidacy speech for becoming European Commission President in July 2019 is proof to that. Again, this shows that change can happen when our leadership is gender responsive. Working to instill this skill into the leadership culture of not only the EEAS or the EU as a whole, but all our institutions is, again, the real hard work. And I'm willing to put my weight behind it, but your help is going to be very much needed because we really need to do this together. And in fact, I believe that you have the power to do this. You are the leaders of the future. The gender-responsive leaders that we need are in this room. We will need you to take forward this leadership and translate it into concrete EU diplomatic initiatives and external actions that take full account of women on an equal basis, thereby transforming EU diplomacy and thereby influencing the security debate. I hope that with this speech you feel empowered to change and to be these gender-responsive leaders that we need. And I look forward to seeing you taking up that role. And with that, I conclude. Thank you so much.